Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is great to be with you. Please take a minute, like, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. We absolutely need and appreciate your support. So, thank you to all the folks who do that. Today, we have longtime guests. I've lost count. I have to go back and count how many episodes we've done now. But Abdaljawad Omar is returning. We're going to talk about obviously the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, Lebanon, regional dynamics, get into Palestine, get into some of the pieces that we didn't finish talking about or didn't really get into in our last conversation. So this should be a really good conversation. It'll probably be one of our longer ones, which I'm looking forward to. For folks who don't know, I don't know what's wrong with you, but Abdaljawad Omar is a Palestinian writer and assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. I have a link in the show description where you can look at basically all of his recent writings for Mondo Weiss. He also writes for a number of other publications, a lot of like more theoretical, even kind of poetic work for communists that he's been writing as well. And maybe we'll reference some of that. But yeah, that's a good introduction. Abdul Jawad, welcome back. It's good to be with you again.
Good to be with you, Jared, as well. Thanks for having me again.
Always, man. It's so good to be in dialogue with you. And, you're genuinely one of the thinkers that I think is capable of talking about this war and all the various fronts of it and having, a nuanced analysis that gives us a lot to think about. So I, look forward to it a lot. Let's start with, because I asked you, I was like, I don't really know what to call this episode, which is not something I usually ask my guests, but you were like, you had a title ready. You said The Longer Fuse, Iran, Lebanon, and the Tremors of Palestine. To me, that suggests you're probably writing something with the title somewhere along those lines. But just talk a little bit about, maybe use the title as a jumping off point in terms of what you're thinking about in relation to this war right now and this concept of the longer fuse.
I mean, I'm not writing anything about it, but it just
not yet.
Point. But I think it's ultimately very important to really situate this current 3-year, 2.5 year, almost 3 years war within this kind of longer durée of its history, specifically since the outset of the Iranian Revolution, which I think is one of the most important transformative moments in the region as a whole, that not only impacts Iran, basically removing the Shah and creating this new form of revolutionary governance that is highly tethered to the idea of sovereignty, anti-hegemonic and anti-imperial posturing, and at the same time energizing through this Islamic Shia discourse, a whole swath of both Arab and Iranian populations. It also produced, I think, this discursive, ideological, but also material shifts. The change from, for instance, the heydays of the 70s and 80s, when you had revolutionary discourses in the Palestinian scene, for instance, tethered around things like armed resistance and revolutionary praxis, coming from the secular nationalist forms, the PFLP, Fatah, others, towards this kind of Islamic revivalist, if you want, discourse, but also this idea or concept of resistance that comes along with it. And I think that is fundamental because it does impact Palestine, it impacts Lebanon, it impacts the Palestinian cause in profound ways, and continues to do so. And we can really thread the line from 1979 until this whole idea, for instance, and concept of unity of fields or wahdat al-sahat that emerged in the years preceding October 7th, and was foundational for the Tufan al-Aqsa, as we saw erupt on October 7th, 2023. Because I think most importantly, that type of decision, beyond the fact that it was not necessarily taken in Tehran or Beirut, and I'm sure that, as the historic record until now shows that, you know, Hezbollah, Iran were surprised by the timing of, this rupture that the Palestinians and the Palestinian resistance in Gaza chose to move towards and take a decision around. However, without that, larger regional network of alliances that have been a part of this war one way or another, either out of their own volition, either through preserving their ontological narratives or attempting to back the Palestinian resistance, I don't think Tufan al-Aqsa would have been possible. Not only in the material sense, but also as a decision that would have been taken. Because part of the decision for Tufan al-Aqsa was in also its conception to create the conditions for the clash of forces in the region, specifically between the anti-hegemonic, anti-imperial forces and the US and Israel and its alliances, an alliance system, of course, that extends towards many of the Arab states that have been bombarded in the past month or so, as we saw unfold throughout the Iran-American confrontation, the Iran-Israel confrontation that has taken place recently. So, this is one important element of this dynamic, that in fact, the cornerstone of the Tufan al-Aqsa decision, first of all, is a rupture that deforms the colonial order around Gaza, breaches its walls, and creates a condition for this larger, if you want, confrontation. And the wager was, and of course remains, that this is a moment where the region can really get rid of the influence of this imperial architecture, that structural change could actually unfold as a result of such a decision. And in fact, in many ways, perhaps in the outset of the war with Gaza, a lot of people came up with the idea that, maybe Wahdat al-Sahat, or unity of fields, has not really materialized in the way that it should have, in the sense that there was a lot of hesitation, at least, or seeming hesitation on the part of, direct engagement of a unified front opened on all levels, Iran attacking, Hezbollah putting all of its force on the table, even invading, as plans were already, kind of conceived of, invading the northern part of historic Palestine, the Galilee, or things along those lines. So that didn't really necessarily materialize in this kind of conception of this kind of synchronic moment of pure, simultaneous eruption of these forces in union, but it did create the conditions for the confrontation for multiple reasons. Partially because the resistance forces did back the Palestinian resistance in Gaza through engagement in Lebanon and Yemen specifically, and partially because Israel has chosen, or after the results of Tufan al-Aqsa, has taken a posture of perpetual war, pushing also these forces into this kind of direct confrontation that we are seeing unfold currently. So I think this is part of what I mean by the longer fuse, is relating to this history, this 4-decade history, and the role of, I think, Palestinian resistance as a spark that created the ripple effects through which we see this moment unfold in its full, repercussions. And in many ways, I think this latest confrontation, in fact, redeems perhaps on some level the decision of Tufan al-Aqsa, because it is exposing the bankruptcy of Israel's perpetual war paradigm, also exposing that it is a client state after all, in a very direct sense of the word. And we'll talk about that perhaps later. And that this third element is also exposing the limits of American power in ways that I don't think we have seen since perhaps Vietnam in this way and fashion, and this intensity, and also in this short period. The world on February 27th is different than the world that we are now, entering. And American levers in the region and choices, as well as this war continues in different ways, are pretty difficult. It's a choice between it's choices of and scenarios that are being placed in front of the American decision maker between a very bad outcome and a worse outcome. And at the same time, the ripple effects of Tufan al-Aqsa continues to produce, I think, this distrust of American power, American credibility, and American ability to solve real concrete problems like the closing of the Strait of Hormuz through military means. And at the same time, not being able to really provision the security guarantees that it has promised its own allies in the Gulf region and beyond. So it is a moment of profound impact on our region. And in many ways, I think the resistance forces are coming out of this struggle slowly but steadily, retaining some form of deterrence, of course, creating the conditions for the deepening of American crisis in the region. And at the same time, exposing Israel's wars that it has been conducting as, I wouldn't say total failure, but as failure and full stop. So this is what I mean by the long refuse, is that if we want to read this moment, we need to read the 4 decades preceding it. If we want to read the role of Palestinian resistance, we cannot read it without, folding it within this larger transformative moment that was the Iranian Revolution and the buildup of forces slowly and steadily in the region that have the capacity to withstand the 3-year war with the full force of American and Israeli air power, with their intelligence capabilities, etc. And at the same time, coming out of that war with strategic gains. I mean, it's relative, perhaps, these strategic gains. It does not mean the liberation of Palestine, at least in the immediate sense of the word, but at least coming out of it with concrete strategic gains. Of course, still, the work continues, so this is still something in progress, and of course, things can go in different ways.
Yeah, I actually wanted to kind of delve into something that we were talking about a little bit before we started, which was just like, you wrote this piece that we talked about. It was and you wrote it on Mondo Weiss, and I think a lot of people read it and took a lot from it, which was, Hamas and the left, or Hamas and the question of the left and the question of Hamas, this kind of, discussion. And I thought it was a really helpful piece to kind of talk about some of the ways that, particularly in the West, right, there is this kind of acceptance of demonizing discourses around Hamas, and a kind of narrative way that people will want to describe Hamas as like conservative, right, or reactionary, or not progressive, right? And you talked in that piece about like, how do we actually think about what's progressive within, a situation of national liberation and, a Palestinian, kind of context. And I thought it was really helpful. And one of the things we were talking about before we started was how I think in many ways, like, maybe Iran is actually even a more difficult question for many people. Maybe not. Maybe it's quite similar. But there is a very strong discourse within the left right now in the West that is sort of this neither the US nor the Iranian state kind of argument, or, that we support the Iranian people, but not their state, right? And yeah, I mean, obviously, from my perspective, of course, this is like, kind of wanting to exist in some kind of utopian, like, nowhere, right? Where, we're not dealing with what's actually unfolding, but also the reality that how are the Iranian people supposed to survive without their own defense, right? Without a state that's able to enact it, right? And so even if you don't agree with all the policies of the state, you have to kind of understand that in this battle against Western imperialism, it does constitute the sort of progressive end of this antagonism. And so I'm curious if you have any other kind of thoughts on that or reflections that you would want to add in this context? Because you started out, talking about the importance of the Iranian Revolution, and in my head are like these sort of Western Marxists who have been in my mentions a lot since the interview with Gabriel Rockhill, who are, really wanting to have a position that doesn't defend the Iranian state, essentially.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what people, I don't want to respond to like some sort of, I don't know what people are saying
Right.
in a specific sense here. There is, of course, always nuanced discussions around, anti-imperial, anti-colonial forces, sometimes their own internal practices, the way they handle the economy, things along those lines. And of course, I am one that insists on that type of nuance. But I think, if you want to speak about like the West, whatever that means in its, larger sense, I mean, throughout these 4 decades, you've been fed an entire apparatus of propaganda around Iran, which actually sometimes does, you invent a lie, you create this fiction around this country, you demonize it in many ways, and then you believe your own lie. And then one of the problems here is that much of the discourse, in the West generally, is not necessarily an accurate reflection of Iranian politics, society, etc. And I don't here pretend to be somebody who's an expert or in Iran or its nuances or contradictions, internal or otherwise, that has inflicted, the nation since its inception. But what we can say, at least from a regional perspective, is that Iran and its revolution is the force that sustained state backing for the Palestinian cause in the region, specifically after the Camp David Accords, where you saw Egypt and the Arab nationalist movement basically committing its own suicide through the Camp David Accords that happened between Egypt and Israel, of course, under the tutelage of American power at that current moment. So you see, like it's even quite maybe coincidental, but you see this Arab nationalist effort led by Jamal Abdel Nasser in the wake of the Nakba coming to an end through Sadat. And a year after, the Iranian Revolution happens. And it is something that opens up a new space, political possibility. Of course, unfortunately, there was a 10-year war between Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and Iran, which also shapes a lot the trajectory of the Iranian Revolution, state, society, etc., specifically in the wake of the revolution itself. But in a nutshell, Iran did provision a new mobilizing discourse that binds, some material Marxist analysis with anti-colonial, anti-imperial politics, with Shia, Islamist also discourse, and they're all bounded together. So they're bounded together in this form, and they are institutionalized, and they're provisioned with the means through which power could be projected in the region, through which resistance formations could be backed, and it impacts the Palestinian intradynamics. Already after the Iranian Revolution, it does push many of the Islamic revivalists, also groups within Palestine, like the Muslim Brotherhood, to slowly but steadily adopt a more revolutionary confrontational posture after years of quietism. So there is an immediate impact. I mean, forces in Palestine like Islamic Jihad and Fath Shiqaqi, who established the Islamic Jihad, was directly influenced by the Iranian Revolution, and creates a condition for their, for some sort of separation from the Muslim Brotherhood and the creation of this new movement that uses this form of Islamic mobilization. Hezbollah in Lebanon, although it kind of precedes, the Iranian Revolution, but is influenced with it because it's through the same networks, through the same religious political networks. It is formed as an anti-colonial resistance to Israeli colonialism in the early 80s and late 1970s. And with the Iranian Revolution, its success, of course, expands gets a lot of material support, is enabled by the Iranian Revolution, and continues to be in alliance with the Iranian state in many ways. So we cannot underestimate the impact of what happened, at least at that historical moment. So for those in the region that yearn for the end of American imperialism, you cannot run away, even if you dislike Iran, even if you have kind of if you're a sectarian and you have an anti-Shia bias, or if you're whatever, even if you're an Arab nationalist, Iran is the power that is sustaining resistance towards American and Israeli, American imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism. So it is what it is. This is the force in the region that is provisioning that support, and in many ways, this is the reason why it's also being fought and contained and economically sanctioned for 4 decades. It is because it's taking that posture, because it's not playing within the rules of the games that Americans want to set, and the Israelis' desire to actually bequeath on the region. It's not like a country like Turkey that is part of the NATO, for instance, and is open economically, neoliberally, etc., and provisions some sort of homage to the Palestinian cause through discourses of Erdogan, but at the same time, at least materially, is still very much immersed, quite literally, in this whole regional infrastructure and system that also the Americans play an important role in sustaining. So it is a country that wants to sit outside of that, sustain its own or build its own capacity to resist, its own industrial economic base, protect its own sovereignty and its ability to take decisions outside American hegemony. And at the same time, as it does that, it did build this network, or help build this network of alliances and resistances that have their own local, internal reasons for being. So they're not necessarily, in this kind of discourse of proxy that, a lot of people try to ascribe to these forces. They're in fact their own, they have their own internal dynamic, reasons for being, their own rationales. Nothing actually proves that more than the decision for Tufan al-Aqsa, which I don't think went really down that well in Iran necessarily. It's not necessarily a decision that Iran was ready for or wanted at that particular historical conjuncture, for instance. So in many ways, I think that when we think of Iran in this configuration, we cannot really dismiss it on the basis of some of the internal contradictions that it has, and of course these are important. It doesn't mean that they're not important, but of course I'm very wary of the extent to which much of the discourse around Iran in the West has been one that attempts to demonize the state, the people, to permit eventually its bombing and the killing of civilians, the hurting of its economy for 4 decades, in the manner that we have seen unfold either through the 4 decades preceding or in the current, 2 wars that happened, the 12-day war and the current war that is unfolding as well.
Yeah, thank you. Let's talk about this moment we're in, this kind of like ceasefire, quote unquote, this sort of stalemate to some degree around the Strait of Hormuz. Like I saw today that I don't know if this is true because the US media just lies to us, but there's supposedly, the US media is reporting that there's a new offer that's made, that Iran has made in opening the strait in exchange for the US stopping the blockade on Iranian ports or ships or whatever. But how do you kind of read what's going on in this period where, at least in Iran, not necessarily in Lebanon, where we'll come back in a minute, but you have this kind of, we would call it like game of chicken, like kind of looking at each other to see who will blink first, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only a game of chicken. I think it is. There are now mirror chokeholds in place, and we can frame it in the sense that there's an economic time war at the current moment. meaning the United States has been blockading or attempting to blockade, Iranian shipping and ports from operating at least since April 13th, and, the Iranians have also effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And each of those basically are calibrated in many ways. So to target the other side's most politically painful pressure points, if you will. So from the Iranian perspective, Hormuz closing means the American consumer feels it at home. And I think there is a tendency, at least if we're reading Iran strategically speaking, is that it really wants to end Trump's presidency, that it's seeking to actually weaken Trump in a way that would actually meaningfully hurt him politically as a result of the decision that he has taken to actually open the war in Iran. So I think this is part of the strategic lay of the land, at least from the Iranian perspective, is that the economic time war that I'm speaking of is on their side, on their benefit. Slowly, the American consumer will feel, higher gasoline prices in the U.S. It's now, I think, around maybe, you can correct me, but $4, something like that. But it could, at some point reach higher levels. And it wants to really place Trump in front of the American electorate in a way that would not allow him or permit him to either sell a triumph in this war, and at the same time, end this kind of like one-directional economic sanctions that have been placed in Iran for the last 4 decades. So in many ways, I mean, the Iranians are playing this card. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. The Americans, on the other hand, of course, have placed this kind of blockade, which will also hurt the Iranians. But already the Iranian economy is suffering. There's a lot of projections around the Iranian economy, contracting and losing a lot of jobs, and already, since a couple of years, the Iranian economy has been eroding in many ways, and Iran was struggling on many fronts, but recently also with rising inflation and the loss of currency value, which was significant in at least the protests that erupted in December and early January. But I don't think this is a symmetric relationship, because I think that, it's true that both sides are squeezing each other, and both sides perhaps slowly but steadily are increasingly hurting. But, I think it's still deeply an asymmetric relationship, because Iran, unlike the US, has 47 years, basically the entire lifetime of the Islamic Republic, where it has optimized itself for survival under sanctions. They have built a parallel financial systems. They built, evasion networks. They have an off-ramp in China and the relationship with Russia. They have an industrial base that is outside of also this kind of international economic, arrangement. So it's true that maybe the pain in terms of its level is right now more or much deeper in Iran. But I think, Trump's and America's situation is quite the inverse. The pain in the United States perhaps is shallower, but, the political tolerance of the electorate in the United States is less. So Iran can withstand and can suffer more. And at the same time, the suffering in the United States will be felt. And as we approach the midterms, which is on November 3rd, I think, if that pain remains, the Iranians are pretty much guaranteeing that Trump will come out in the midterms having lost both, the House and the Senate, which makes him more or less, a lame duck president, in the sense if you have, an anti-Trump coalition within the Congress and the Senate, they will be pushing, much more forcibly against any Trumpian agenda in the next 2 years or so. So I think that in nutshell that, I think the Iranians are reading that time is on their side. and in many ways it's true. And they're also playing within this parameter of effectively holding the Strait of Hormuz and controlling it in a way that also gives them levers and leverage in relation to other countries, even those countries that have alliances with the United States of America. So they are striking, side deals, with France sometimes here, with, other countries here and there, in a way that permits them to also still retain one of the strategic advantages that they have going into this war. And one of the strategic advantages of also not engaging from the outset in the decision of Tufan al-Aqsa, which that Iran is presenting itself as defending itself from aggression, which is true. It's presenting itself as being rational and calculated, unlike the United States, which have, in conducting and committing itself to this war, seem to be inflicted by either the hubris of what Prime Minister Netanyahu sold to Trump, or if we take the word of the New York Times on what actually unfolded before the decision to go into war, or not allowing or permitting a wide international coalition to actually engage in this war. So, basically, the Europeans are neutralized in many ways. They're outside of the frame. They're still applying sanctions, but they're not willing to engage in the war. And in the information war, in the media perception, in people's cognitive relationship to the war, it does seem like a war that, the Iranians are on the right, at least when it comes to even, people who are not truly invested, or the layman, or etc. That Iran was not really attacking anybody, and then they were attacked without any real justification in a moment where they were negotiating with the Americans in Oman, and where the Omani foreign minister was actually saying that the negotiations were going really well, and they were meeting in Geneva, etc., etc., etc. So I think in this sense, Iran's strategic hold on Hormuz and time is operating on its side. And this is what it's happening, at least from the perspective of the Iranians. What the Iranians propose, at least there are reports that they propose something like, lift the blockade, Trump, we will lift, the chokehold we have on the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, I think they mean it in a way where they still retain formal control, and perhaps even extract from moving ships some sort of toll, or perhaps not. I'm not really certain around that, but they will maintain some sort of effective formal control. And let's postpone the talk about, nuclear weapons and enrichment and all of these different, sticking issues that the Americans are placing front and center in the negotiations, hoping to come out of some sort of win by forcing the Iranians to provide Trump with an agreement that is better than Obama's agreement. I think this is what Trump wants at this particular moment. Something that he could sell that, after I opened this war and fired a lot of shots and did all this economic damage internationally, etc., that I came out with a better deal than Obama was able to get without actually engaging in any kinetic war effort. So I think the Iranians don't want to give him that win. And by proposing this kind of lifting the two blockades, or, there, and postponing the nuclear or any negotiations on sticking issues later on, the Iranians would be still able to maneuver themselves, negotiate from a position of power, having established the proof of concept that they are able to close the Strait of Hormuz at any point. So that's still a leverage, but at the same time, not give Trump any form of win at this particular conjuncture. So Trump is very much keen on getting some sort of win, but incapable of doing that. And I don't think the Iranians want to give him that. I think they want to run him down slowly but slowly, and weaken him and weaken his presidency as Trump approaches the midterm and is placed on the electoral test on November 3rd.
Yeah, appreciate it. Let's talk about Lebanon, because obviously there's been a lot kind of since we talked last about not only the war, which has gone through. I mean, initially it was supposed to be included in the ceasefire, right? Then there was kind of Israel's maneuvering and the United States going along with it of like, oh no, it's not, and then all this kind of charade in Washington to create a separate ceasefire. And yet still there's obviously still a war that's going on there between, in the South, basically. So the sort of ceasefire that exists seems to only apply to the North, which is, I mean, interesting, right? Because obviously Lebanon is really kind of the Lebanese state in a certain way is giving away the sovereignty in a lot of ways of the south half of the country. But yeah, how are you reading this? I mean, it seems like this front, in terms of on a military level, is still quite unsuccessful in terms of Israel's attempts, in particular, to have kind of military gains there. But how are you reading all of those dynamics?
Well, I mean, like, first of all, I mean, it should be, quite clear that what really unfolded since the outset of also this war, meaning after February 27th, is that Hezbollah took the decision to join the war and wagering on a unity of fields concept that we were placing front of center, where I think Hezbollah would lean on Iran to provision it with leverage in relation to the war-fighting effort in Lebanon itself, and at the same time in attaining a ceasefire that would be still under the paradigm that engulfed, if you want, the relationship between Hezbollah and Israel preceding October 7th, which is a condition of mutual deterrence, at least at that particular moment in history, where Israel didn't really dare to attack Lebanon because Hezbollah would attack Israel at the same time. And there was this kind of, rules of the games that are not formalized in any form of agreement, but that Hezbollah understood and the Israelis understood. And I think to a large extent, Hezbollah's decision and the Hezbollah Iranian strategy has been successful, even in terms around the ceasefire that you have been mentioning, because what is now quite clear is that despite the fact that the Israeli army is, destroying, the border villages and towns and cities across the southern Lebanese belt, and at the same time trying or attempting to create this kind of security zone. First of all, they're facing a war of attrition where Hezbollah has not stopped firing. So it's different than the situation in the past 15 months before this war, where Hezbollah remained quiet and did not actually engage the Israeli military in any significant way. So there are injuries every day being pulled from Lebanon towards Israeli hospitals, soldiers being killed. There's the use of also new forms of tactics, FPV drones, etc., that have proven, quite successful in targeting Israeli military. So Hezbollah is engaging and giving, a bloody nose for the Israeli military as it goes. But at the same time, the ceasefire terms has actually tamed one of Israel's, powerful weapons, which is its power to destroy across Lebanon itself. So you have a much more balanced form of fighting taking place, at least at this current moment. And if you look at the Israeli press, they're quite despondent about what's happening because it is something that the Americans have forced them into. And, there is some sort of, understanding between the Israelis and Americans on the extent to which they can use their firepower in Lebanon. For instance, Beirut cannot be targeted. Of course, that doesn't mean they will not target it at all. Maybe on some level, at some moment, they would open fire towards Beirut or towards other areas in Lebanon. But, the current conditions are not really favorable for the Israeli military. Imagine, the Gaza war without Israel's capacity to destroy and kill civilians and commit daily massacres in the scale that it did, and actually trying to fight, Palestinian fighters on the ground while neutralizing, its air power, firepower capacities. I mean, this is what's really happening in southern Lebanon at this particular moment. And I think the more Israel entrenches itself in the Lebanon, attempts to retain that security zone under these conditions, the more it's clear that it will be dealt a heavy defeat in its engagement with the Lebanese resistance. So this is one element of it. But I think the larger, if you want, point is that Iran has been successful in really tying Lebanon and the regional, network that it has built throughout, specifically, in Yemen and Lebanon, perhaps less so in Gaza. At least the discourse around it is not very public. If there's any move towards that, tying it to any arrangements with the Americans and negotiations that are happening and unfolding. So that has also been a success from an Iranian perspective. It has been able to kind of unify its fronts, deal with Lebanon as if it's part of the ceasefire that it has committed itself with the Americans, forcing the Americans to force the Israelis to tame at least their military operations in Lebanon, and at the same time provision both the legitimacy and the ability of Hezbollah to engage the Israeli military without facing heavy repercussions on civilian civic infrastructure and massacres, the terms that Israel uses to try to pressure the popular base on which resistance is built, the society itself targeting the civilians itself and committing these massacres, as we saw unfortunately in Lebanon on that bloody, I think, Wednesday, when they the Israeli air power in 10 minutes killed around 300 people who were in their homes safely and without really targeting anybody on a military level or political level. It was just a massacre committed in daylight, targeting Beirut and other areas in Lebanon as a way to basically create this statement that Lebanon will not be included in the ceasefire, when eventually Lebanon was actually included in the ceasefire. So this is the terms to which Iran, Hezbollah sees the current moment, retaining again deterrence, retaining the rules of the games, trying to balance the equations once again. That was, in the past at least 15 months or so, very favorable for Israel. Israel was basically regionalizing its terror regime, as I once said, maybe in this with you, Jared, which is, it's doing what it does in the West Bank, but through different tools, which is it can arrest whoever it wants, kill whoever it wants at moment's notice without any real retaliation. Now it's facing resistance and constraints by its, sponsor and patron, which is the United States. But for also the Israelis, it's quite a moment of, also looking like they're a client state. They have to adhere to American demands. It's this constraint that is coming from the U.S. where they're incapable really of rebelling, and in fact, it's quite quite a scandal, if you want, even in Israeli politics and the relationship between its political class and the military class, because you would hear Netanyahu saying that big statements like unleash all the power on Lebanon, but in fact nothing is really unleashed. In the sense of seeing air power fully utilized in Lebanon, for instance, or its firepower fully utilized in Lebanon. So there's this kind of growing gap between the political class rhetoric on the one hand and the actual developments on the ground. That's one element of it. And of course, perhaps for Israel, because it's a weight game, this could erupt at any moment and they could return and take the strategic initiative again. Wedging or hedging that, or wagering that the Americans will eventually have to re-engage in the war in the full sense of the terms. And of course, the Americans have been moving a lot of military pieces to the region. I think we have 3 carrier strikes, carrier groups, I think, now in the region, the largest kind of buildup since the Iraqi war. In 2003. So, there are also movements of troops towards the region. So, of course, Trump is sustaining this kind of option for military engagement, which is also central. And the Israelis are being quiet because they're wagering that eventually Trump will have to take the decision again to engage the Iranians and go into full-on, bombing campaign in Iran again, or some sort of also maybe control of some of the islands around Hormuz, or, an attack that is conceived that includes maybe amphibian forces with air power, where they want to retain control over the strait, something along those lines. And of course, each of the options that the Americans have really are very difficult, because I think one of the misreadings, and I know I'm here going on off ramp, but one of the misreadings of the war is that even if Iran didn't have the Strait of Hormuz as a lever, on a military basis of the engagement between Iran and the US, in fact, Iran was able to inflict a lot of damage on the bases, on American troops, equipment, and of course, sustain its ballistic missile launches and, of course, drones throughout the war in a way that its own military successes, even if they didn't have the same power of destruction as the Americans and the Israelis have in relation to Iran, was very successful. So in many ways, even the military engagement itself was one where Iran was also quite successful in sustaining not only the military effort, but in extracting a heavy price from the Americans and its regional allies. And it's also its military, infrastructure in the region more broadly, radar systems, airplanes, bases. And I think the extent of damage is slowly coming up, and you see reports increasingly of the extent of the damage that the Iranians have actually managed to inflict on the Americans, specifically in the Gulf region. And as the picture comes clear, I think part of the reason why the Americans also went for a ceasefire is because that damage was increasing in its intensity. And at the same time, Iran was not really ceasing its operation in any significant way. And as time passed, the Americans and the Israelis didn't have an answer to the question of how to stop the drones and the ballistic missiles, despite the fact that they were always advertising the extent of damage that they had for launchers. Every time they come with a number, there's only 200 launchers left, et cetera. And then eventually, after, I don't know, killing half of these launchers and another half of these launchers, and they endlessly come up again and again. So you didn't even know if these numbers actually reflect anything true, or some hubris from intelligence agencies, or some hubris from military, spokespeople who are, spreading some sort of either misinformation, or the Iranians were able to basically light all of this and create the conditions for the continuation of their war effort campaign in a way that was significant. So this is also one part of the paradigm. So even if it didn't have the Strait of Hormuz, where it could choke the global economy, the military engagement itself was very difficult. And one of the other factors of advantage that people talk about less when it comes to Iran is that its geography is very rigid. It's mountainous. It's not an easy country to actually invade. It is a very hard, a very big country. It's huge in terms of its mass. The Iranians have built their entire, even civilian infrastructure, not only their military infrastructure, in a way to also, thinking of, war with the US and Israel. The entire system has been built to withstand an asymmetric conflict in military strategy, military capabilities, in sustaining war effort, but also even in terms of the civilian infrastructure. So on all these fronts, the Iranians have proven, have provisioned a proof of concept around their warfighting capabilities, strategies, but at the same time using this big lever which they have, which is the Strait of Hormuz. So they were able to fold Lebanon. This is the strength of the Iranian position. They were able to fold Lebanon directly in the negotiation, and force the Americans to at least to constrain and limit Israeli actions in Lebanon in a way that is now giving, on the ground, Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance an advantage that it didn't have before in terms of the military engagement that is occurring. And of course, this is not to underestimate the extent of sacrifices or damage that have happened already to many of the villages and towns in southern Lebanon. A lot of them have been destroyed fully, almost fully. The scenes coming out of these places are horrific in many ways. And Israeli forces are still there. They are engaging in wholesale bombing, like we saw detonation like we saw in the Gaza Strip, which it continues to also do in the Gaza Strip as well. So in many ways, I think that is also part of the equation in Lebanon that is happening. Now, on the other hand, like unfortunately for us in this region, we always have these forces, for whatever historic, sectarian, political reasons, that are willing to actually encourage the Israelis, encourage the Americans to continue bombing and killing and giving them the strategic advantage. In Lebanon, unfortunately, there are, many sources for that, and I don't want to go into it, but the Lebanese state has chosen to give the Israelis an offer, by extending this idea of negotiations towards a peace agreement that normalizes the relationship between Lebanon and Israel. And some of the forces within Lebanon that are in direct contradiction with Hezbollah have been arguing this argument for some time. Of course, this is nothing new in Lebanon. You have the right-wing phalangists, for instance, that actually signed a peace agreement in the 1980s with Israel. Of course, that peace agreement didn't go anywhere because it was, rejected by Lebanese society, and they were really driven out of power. Some of the leaders were assassinated, etc. But in many ways, it is in Lebanon, maybe, I don't want to take it in simplistic terms, but because it's a society and a political system built around sects, whenever one sect has a bit of power, and in this case, for instance, the Shia sect, the other sects kind of conspired to weaken that one sect that has the power. So this is, and it goes in all directions. If the Christians have power, others, and on some level, this is part of the play of other political forces in Lebanon who are seeking at this current moment to basically take the destructive capacity of Israel, use it against Hezbollah in the internal argument around peace with Israel, and try to basically embezzle the Lebanese population that the only way that we can actually ensure that we don't have any wars in the future is through some sort of peace agreement, which is actually really a surrender agreement where Hezbollah gives up its weapons, etc. And to some degree, of course, the Americans are pushing that line. Some of these internal forces are pushing that line. The state, at least in the form of the prime minister, who comes from the Sunni sect, his name is Nawaf Salam, and of course, the president, Joseph Aoun, are both basically part of this push towards direct negotiations with Israel, going towards a ceasefire and eventually reaching an agreement that would see a delimitation of borders, but also a peace agreement and a diplomatic recognition and all of the things that come with that. Something along what Egypt and Jordan signed, Jordan in the 1990s and Egypt in the 70s. Of course, the problem for those forces in the Lebanese state is that Israel actually did not engage with them, despite the fact that they were ready to do that for some time. They only became interested, the Israelis, when the strategic lever became or is really rising against them, in the way that Hezbollah is resurgent. It has reorganized its military command and control structure. It has, adopted new tactics. It has rearranged itself in a much more disciplined way, preventing, until now we haven't seen really any form of deep, intelligence around this new form of Hezbollah in any significant way that would actually weaken it. Or would enable Israel to really hurt it like it hurt it in September of 2024 when we had the pager walkie-talkie attacks, and then the assassination of the military and political leadership of Hezbollah at that current moment. So in many ways, as the strategic lever has been is on Hezbollah's side, on the Lebanese resistance side, also folded within this kind of regional arrangement, alliance with Iran, where Iranian power also has the backing of the Lebanese resistance in a way that has already constrained and tamed Israeli ability to actually inflict damage and go all in terms of its destructive power. The Israelis have chosen to also take this route towards some sort of direct engagement with the Lebanese. So it is like an off-ramp that the Lebanese state gave the Israelis, and the Israelis became interested in the moment where they're feeling that their position in Lebanon is becoming weaker and weaker. But they do understand one thing fundamentally about these negotiations is really that those negotiating from the Lebanese side have really no real power to actually take Hezbollah's weapon. And they've already used all the levers of power in relation to Hezbollah. What I mean by that is that they already delegitimized the resistance. They've already issued that the resistance is illegal. They've already took these steps. And these steps were levers, if you want, or leverages that in the internal Lebanese discussion, you would have been able to use it vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And you're incapable really of, engaging the Lebanese resistance in a way where you force it to actually give up the weapons. So it's only through some sort of engagement with the Lebanese resistance that the Lebanese resistance acquiesces or agrees or informally or formally that you're able to go through these negotiations in a way that is meaningful. So at this current moment, at least from an outside perspective like myself, what I see is that the Lebanese state is engaging with the Israelis, but it's a sideshow that doesn't have any real significant or outcome because already the Lebanese state in relation to Hezbollah has given up whatever lever it has in sense of, again, it already delegitimized, taking out the legal umbrella through which the resistance existed, already declared, if you want, Hezbollah outside of the law, things along these lines that Hezbollah relied on for this larger, if you want, legitimacy and legalization within the Lebanese state framework. So they've already done these steps radically, and at the same time, they don't have the acquiescences of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is strategically in a position with increasing power and lever. So I think that partly what pushed really the Lebanese state and the forces that are backing, this prime minister and president, and at the same time Israel, is that Hezbollah has been strengthening and their position has been weakening. That's what is pressuring them into this kind of negotiations held by the United States. And of course, the United States also wanted in many ways to kind of provision a picture, a perception that what is taming Israel now in Lebanon is not the Strait of Hormuz, it's not Iran, it is, these kind of negotiations. But for anybody, just objectively speaking, looking at the real facts and objective facts on the ground, the Israelis would not be interested in taming themselves because they're negotiating with the Lebanese state. They would have done that in the past 15 months if they really truly wanted to do so. It is only through the direct engagement of both the Lebanese resistance and Iran in the war that you have this condition where the Lebanese resistance is now at least strategically in a position where it could engage the Israeli military, hurt it, bloody it, and at the same time not really face the full force of its destructive power across Lebanon.
Thank you. So where I want to go next is, and we can, I want to move into some discussion around some different dynamics in Palestine, but also before we go there, I do want to talk about the piece that you wrote about Israeli traders. Like, this was an interesting kind of phenomenon that I don't think people are really following too closely in the West, but it seems to be a significant concern within Israeli press, at least, of the presence of Israelis who are being recruited to offer up information to Iran. And so talk a little bit about the dynamics of this, like what seems to be happening, why this is, it's interesting, right? Because, I would think that there's a good amount of kind of social cohesion among Israelis in support of the Zionist project and so on and so forth. But this shows something interesting, I think, in terms of some of the things that are going on within Israeli society.
Yeah, I think it is a significant phenomenon in many ways that you have. Um, there's something that is really unfolding inside Israel over the past couple of years, but also at least increasingly over the last year, which reveals something about Israeli society as well. Uh, and it's being reported by the Israeli press quite a lot. Um, and it really shapes up to tell something about, again, Israeli society and the conditions under which it is right now. There are a lot of cases coming up through court system of regular Israeli citizens, but also increasingly people within sensitive military positions, like the Air Force, for instance, who are accused of, working with the enemy in the time of war. And the Israeli internal security services are really catching some of these networks increasingly within Israel. And it really moves this paradigm where Israel has in the past, been able to really recruit a lot of human intelligence based on internal contradictions in Arab society, based on economic conditions of people in Arab, but also in Iran and other places where people are impoverished, so money could be an enticement towards working with the enemy, towards really Israelis now being recruited for really, small amounts of money, generally given by Iranians towards regular Israeli citizens that range in age, range in terms of their ethnic and political backgrounds, range in terms of their whether they're new, new immigrants between quotes in Israel, or even older Ashkenazi, Israelis who have been there for a long time. But the fact is that it is a phenomenon. The Israeli press even calls it an epidemic. Of course, the Israelis have this tendency to overblow something, to over exaggerate, to ring the alarm bells quite heavily, in a way where like a small phenomena or a phenomena that is increasing intensity in tendency and intensity is treated as this kind of paranoid, overblown type of rhetoric and discourse. But however, even as they claim or they name it as an epidemic, it does tell us something about Israeli society, because I think it does reflect a growing socioeconomic disparity within Israel between, the billionaire class and the rest of society, specifically those coming from low middle class or new immigrants that are not integrated as well as others. And at the same time, that the corruption in the top of society, basically somebody like Prime Minister Netanyahu, the series of scandals that also has inflicted his administration, whether it's things like Qatar Gate or his own corruption, that basically Israelis feel a sense of entitlement where we could work for the enemy. And at the same time, that is something that we're doing, not in betrayal, but because that is our own entitlement to actually gain some sort of financial advantage and leverage. So it's, of course, this is not this is not an ideological traitor. For instance, Israelis did have, the Communist Party, some people who were tied to the Soviet Union based on ideology, for instance, or sometimes this kind of one corrupt official or minister who would, sell secrets, even for the Iranians. There's one famous case of that as well. But this is regular citizens that increasingly feel entitled because on the top of, those who are leading the country are also corrupt. Those who are leading the country are also taking, back channel bribes from Qatar, and at the same time they hear their prime minister accusing Qatar of being, this threat on the Israeli state, even wanting to classify Qatar as an enemy state while his aides are taking money from Qatar and working actually for Qatar. So that kind of discrepancy and dissonance is basically seeping into Israel society. So Iran is basically doing these kind of spray, engaging wide masses of Israelis through social networks and social media networks, etc., and then recruiting from there. But it is finding a ready soil for that recruitment. Because of these socioeconomic dynamics, because of these kind of corruptions that are happening on the level of the political class in Israel, because of a lot of different scandals that have hit in, Israeli society in the past couple of years, where strangely and steadily there is this growing sense of entitlement, where Israelis feel that they could work with the Iranians even in time of war, and still not be, if you want, a traitor. And the Israeli press is calling it an epidemic. But again, for me, what is interesting about all of that is not only the intelligence dynamic, although the recent case is significant in the sense that it was 2 Air Force operators. So they're not pilots, but people who work in the Air Force who are also being accused of working for the Iranians and, leaking some information about the Air Force, and also asked to assassinate and or engage in, much more direct action against, the Israeli military infrastructure, etc. But it does say that, the Iranians have been successful in penetrating Israeli society on some level. They have been successful in garnering intelligence from Israeli citizens as well. And that we have this common traitor now, which exists in the Arab world, which exists in Iran, that also operates within Israeli society more, creating more distrust, if you want. And there are early signs of some sort of social fragmentation and disintegration. Because one of the things that have sustained Israel throughout the past 70 years or so is this kind of ideological coherence, this idea that we engage in wars of necessity, this idea that we are, the Europeans, facing the barbarians at the gate, and that we need to remain homo, in even if we have differences, even if we have divergences, we maintain loyalty to the state and the idea of Israel, that we have this sense of pride, sense of, if we don't betray, our society, we create the conditions where others betray their own. This is part of the paradigm that Israelis have sustained, and of course that is part of their, rhetoric around their own invincibility, omnipotence, their own power. And we can see that this dynamic is already, even if it's slight, even if it's still early on, but is in many ways shifting. And I don't think Iran is pulling or planting something in a soil that rejects what it's planting. It is planting something and being able to recruit, because the soil has been in many ways poisoned in Israeli society.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask this question, and then I got to let somebody in real quick, but I'll be listening and I'll be right back. But let's talk about Birzeit a little bit, and some of the dynamics of the West Bank. We haven't talked about this enough. And you wrote a piece that really kind of talked about historically the importance of Birzeit University, and seeing it as kind of hollowed out in certain ways, and you talked about examples of this, that it wasn't so much, for instance, like a lot of people have talked, and we've even had people that watch this show reach out, like hearing about the raids and things like that, and they'll say, oh, is Aboud okay, like but it wasn't so much the raids and things like this that were happening as like the response or the the politics on campus. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, of course, like, Birzeit was conceived in the 1970s. It was part of actually the drive within Palestine for this kind of institutional autonomy at that moment. And much of actually the infrastructure and the grounds for the rise of the first Intifada as this kind of coherent civil disobedience, non-cooperation form of engagement with the Israeli direct military rule at that moment came from the prowess of this kind of institutional build-up that the Palestinian society was engaged on, building kind of national institutions within the persistence of the military occupation. And Birzeit was one of the most important institutions in this sense. And this is why actually Birzeit, when it was conceived, it was also in many ways the the meeting place for nationalist, leftist, and Islamist intellectuals, a place where social sciences and humanities were more significant than any other, if you want, discipline in the university, of course, alongside other disciplines like engineering, etc. But I think, of course, since the 70s, a lot of radical changes have happened across the university. And, I think it is not the same institution it was once. There's a lot of changes. And I think in the piece, I was trying to chart out some of these changes. And I think where I start was this kind of Tuesday morning when Israeli forces arrived at Birzeit University and at the campus. And maybe for the first time, I wouldn't say the first time ever, but the first time, as the semester was closing, they entered and invaded the campus, knowing very well that clashes would erupt the moment they would enter, and of course using live fire within the campus. And then we had more than 40 injured students, at least in that specific raid. Fortunately, nobody was killed. However, there was something that was significant, at least for me and for others that were witnessing at least what was unfolding in the wake of it. I think that in many instances, what we saw from the student movement, specifically at Birzeit, which used to be also, and remains to some degree, but used to be one of the pillars of Birzeit. Birzeit had three pillars: the administration, the teachers' union, and the student movement. And for those who aren't aware, it's still pretty much the student movement has a lot of power in the university. I mean, it's a student movement that can close the university, strike whenever it chooses. It's a student movement that will hold elections and have this kind of grandiose debate between students that is watched actually by Palestinians everywhere, not only in Birzeit campus. So the debate has nothing to do with campus issues. It's about politics. It's about the policy of Mahmoud Abbas, the president, or Hamas, or what happened, etc. Of course, for the past 2 years, because of the war, these debates were not really going on. So the student movement had this history, and it actually produced much of the leadership of the Palestinian national movement. People like Marwan Barghouti came from the Birzeit student movement, for instance. People like Fathi Shiqaqi as well, who established the Islamic Jihad. So there, Yahya Ayyash, who's a central figure in Hamas's early military development. So in many ways, the university was and remains a hotbed, and also producing much of the leadership of the Palestinian national movement more broadly, both in the Islamic revivalist, domain, but also in the nationalist, secular, etc. But what was surprising, at least for those who care about Birzeit like myself, is that the student movement, despite this invasion, that was actually the pretext of it was that the Israelis wanted to shut down a very regular occurrence at Birzeit University, where students do this kind of like solidarity with prisoners or something along those lines. And of course, we could speak here something about what the Israeli intelligence officer that took this decision of invading the campus saw in terms of a weakness at this moment in the West Bank society. Is that, okay, there is this institution, still it has a nationalist activities within it. And despite the fact that these activities don't really disrupt or don't have really a political value in the sense of at least they don't engage the military. They're not, they're just, sit-ins within the university, parameters. People come gather for an hour and then they leave. It's nothing really disruptive in the sense of creating any conditions for actual confrontation, direct or otherwise. But I think that the Israelis did sense that it is time where we can pressure the Birzeit community and the Birzeit institution to stop even these forms of symbolic, not very meaningful forms of, sit-ins or, demonstrations or whatever happens within the university campus. And I think this is also a way in which we can see how the Israeli military intelligence are pushing towards an institution without any form of politics, etc. So this is maybe the pretext for the Israelis for engaging in this and for showing this kind of spectacle that is a bit shocking, entering, firing live bullets, etc. But there was no real response from the student movement. What we moved towards, because it was the semester closing, was the students actually striking and closing the university down because we have exam weeks and they didn't want the exams to happen on campus. They want the exams to happen online. And of course, the reasons they gave, outward reasons, were that, a lot of students have a lot of problems coming to the campus because of checkpoints, etc., that it might not be fair for some of them if they have several exams and they're late to one of them. So these were the nature of the demands coming from the student movement and why they wanted to move the exams online. The university was very willing to actually say that, okay, we'll lessen the amount of exams every day. We'll push the start of the exam later on in the day so that we can accommodate any form of students who are late. And if there's a student who's late, we can also repeat the exam for that particular student in the condition. So the university was willing to engage with the student movement on that level, but still the student movement insisted to close and strike down the university, which is very disruptive, of course, for the whole, institution and community. And secretly, what we know, all of us, of course, is that part of why they wanted to move the exams online is that the students want to actually provision a legalized way to cheat. So this is the basic, fact of why they wanted to move online, because it's easier to cheat when you're like in a distance. There's less surveillance. There's no, the exams are not being held, and it's very hard to really contain what students do and who actually does the exam if it's, in terms of being conducted remotely, etc. And I think this is a very telling moment. And here, I'm not trying to moralize against the students, but it is a structural. There is a structural level of this analysis. It's not saying that this, generation is, a lost generation, like a lot of my colleagues are saying. I think that it is the very fact that students are really cannot really tie or do not see the value of their studies. That's one element. I mean, it's a very hopeless terrain in which we live, and the link between the disciplines they choose and the actual reality that they face after the university is really wide, where they don't see really the value of the classes itself. The cynicism of the teachers that is also dealing with overworked, large loads of students coming in, treating them without, any form of personal understanding of each student, because you have, large amounts of students in each class. So you're treating them as these kind of more abstract form numbers, people who witness you lecture, but you don't really have an interpersonal relationship that is significant, and you cannot really develop it. Where the political affective terrain as well is telling them on some level that the world is hopeless. There's no real changes that could be done, and of course that comes on the heels that I think it's a more universal phenomena of the rise of these kind of AI systems, where students have stopped to think for themselves and basically can outsource the thinking towards this tool that they use in a way that make, if you want, the paradox of it, as much as AI could be helpful, for instance, in doing things, at the same time it's just making students dependent almost completely on doing all the thinking for them, outsourcing it almost completely. The more access we have to information, it seems the less analytical, the less willing to actually go through the hard steps of learning and pedagogy that we need, etc. And that's part of also the situation at Birzeit University. So I think that this whole paradox of ignoring this whole shocking moment of the army, entering the campus and really engaging in this kind of fight with the administration, with the university closing it down to enable cheating is something that I think attention that is one that we can build on the situation of the institution itself and how it's been hollowed out, but at the same time on the situation of the West Bank itself, where I think people are sensing a sense of hopelessness, are feeling a sense that really nothing really matters. There is a lot of cynicism around, and I think a lot of nihilism as well that is feeding into this moment. And no more matter the mantras used in justifying the closing down of the university on the basis of checkpoints, etc. I think that that's the context to which I wrote that piece. It's kind of a lamentation, and it is one of my darker pieces because I was quite, perhaps angry with the condition in which an institution I love and I care about, is increasingly being, hauled out in this way on the part of its three major components. I don't blame the students for it: the administration, the economic conditions, structural changes, technological, and at the same time, the political condition in Palestine that is driving this kind of hollowing. And slowly, of course, these changes sometimes are daily, they're not really sensed, but eventually after years, they seem inevitable. They seem like they're sitting there inevitable, and that the university thought you knew has completely and radically really changed.
Yeah, I hear you. And hopefully we'll see some shifts in some of those dynamics. But I've done the AI thing is really, I have a lot of issues with it. I mean, even conversations with Dwayne Monroe that we've had on it, so people can check those out. But I mean, and it's very frustrating also that I think teachers and administrators are not more organized too. I mean, in respect to fighting the use, and I mean, in many cases, districts, universities, teachers unions are actually inviting AI into their settings, right? Rather than recognizing that this is a huge problem on a lot of levels. And like you say, it's not kind of a moral thing. It's really more about, you know, I mean, there's a lot of elements of it, but one is that it doesn't help educate. It actually, does the opposite. All right, so let's talk about let's talk about the death penalty law. Because we haven't discussed this yet on the show, and obviously it's very significant, important development. In the piece that you wrote about it, you talk about how there's the precedent for this that goes all the way back to the British Mandate period. You also talk about, which I totally agree with, that kind of in a colonial context, and the United States is the same way this way with our own history of settler colonialism and imperialism, that like force and lawlessness by the state often is kind of the way that law is produced, right? So it's not as though law is some kind of neutral set of values or whatever reflected. But you note the kind of frankness in this moment does mean something important. And so I wanted to pull out a quote of yours, which is, quote, "What Israel does and what Israel is willing to admit to doing are now the same thing. And when a political project stops apologizing for itself, it rarely goes back." So say a little bit about that and the kind of political importance of the death penalty law as it has recently been passed, explicitly targeting Palestinians.
Well, I mean, I think we can start, with the image that I also start with the piece, which is, Ben-Gvir, who takes a lot of pride. Even recently, I mean, I think today or yesterday, he produced this video where there's a box of complaints from prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and he's reading them. And he's like, good, this is what it should be. The prison should not be a hotel. Of course, Israeli prisons were never a hotel. That's the first thing. But I think the picture of this kind of, Israel's national security minister, Ben-Gvir, standing on the floor of the Knesset and with champagne bottles, opened, and celebrating the passage of this kind of new death penalty law. And I think, it's very clear, first of all, like a lot of people have been made, and I make also in the piece quite clear that this death penalty law, first and foremost, is only for Palestinians. So this is not a death penalty law that applies, equally across ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. So there's already this kind of racialized image that comes across. The rope is only for Arabs, as the title of the piece also quite makes clear. And what I wanted to actually really dig as well in the piece is this, that it really harkens back towards British colonial policy. In fact, to be honest, much of Israel's policies are really drawn from British colonial playbook. Even its own military, its development, the development of its, this kind of aggressive raids vis-a-vis villages, comes from somebody called Ord Wingate, who was, a British officer that taught all of the initial heads of Israeli military, like people like Moshe Dayan, etc. So they all learned through going through this kind of British system: military fighting capacities, aggressive policies, willingness to, for example, like Ord Wingate used to do, gather the Palestinians before 1948 on a wall, and if people don't confess, shoot one and kill them in front of the others, so people would start confessing. These type of policies. And Ord Wingate was also known, for instance, for the night raids, because the night was always and remains, if you want, the ally of resistance. Under the cover of the night, you can do things in secret. You can be out of the scopic regime of surveillance on some level. You can do things that, the light day cannot actually, or the light day prevents you from them. So Ord Wingate was known for actually turning and inverting that, and committing to these night raid against villages that hosted Palestinian revolutionaries and peasant revolutionaries in the 1930s, etc. Again, Israel's military, its thinking around discipline, around the logic of punishment, around military even aggression and policy, was developed by the British. And also the idea, for instance, in this case, of applying this execution law or death penalty law vis-a-vis Arabs and specifically Palestinians who are willing to resist. And the British committed a lot of these murders and executions in the 1929, in the 1930s of Palestinian revolutionaries. And in fact, if one goes to the Palestinian poetic tradition or the Palestinian literary tradition, but specifically poetry in the 1930s and songs that came out of that poetry, much of it also relates to the idea of executions and these rebellion or these peasant revolutionaries actually being executed by the British. So I wanted to, first of all, really concretely say that this is nothing new, that this is a retainment of an old form applied into the present. And I think that's one of the elements of the piece that at least I wanted to make clear. The second one I wanted to make, which is tied to the role of law in colonial context. I think always, and this is what I say in the piece, the law catches reality, not the other way around. The law doesn't really define the context through which people engage in conflict. In fact, law is produced through this kind of direct engagement between the colonizer and the colonized, and then the law tries to catch up with whatever the colonizer is doing. And in this sense, by applying a death penalty law, what you're already kind of subscribing to or legalizing in retrospect is a policy that in fact Israel was committing to in the past years, which is executing Palestinians extrajudicially. They've done that in mass. They do it at every opportunity that is possible, whether it's through assassinations or killing attackers, even if these attackers have been neutralized in the sense that they don't actually provision any direct threat on the Israeli military at that moment or police or anything along those lines. So execution has been practiced. It is in practice already And in this sense, what this law comes to do is legalize something that is already there. So law catches up with reality, but then when it catches up with reality, what it does, it provisions even more space for violence that is outside them. That's the problem with this kind of, they're kind of like a feedback loop that propel each other forward. And that's one of the problems that we have, at least, or one could think of this line in this sense. The other or third element I think we spoke about, quite a lot, which is the one you mentioned through the quote. I think that, yes, it is a moment where Israel is revealing itself out in the open without any form of shame around that revelation and that exposition. It did practice an obscene genocide. It did not try to keep it secret. Of course, there are denials around it's genocide, it's not genocide, things along those lines. There are rhetoric that attempts to justify, for example, the killing of journalists, but it is being shameless. And it is a form of power to transgress every norm, law, etc., and at the same time to not be held accountable. But Israel has basically, because of what it's committing in daylight, through social media, through its, for example, going to Lebanon and encountering a church, taking a Jesus Christ statue and destroying it, for instance, and taking a picture of them. Not only destroying it in secret, but taking a picture of them. And for that picture to circulate, it is and will pay a heavy price, because it is actually really fundamentally exposing itself towards that structural contradiction that we spoke about, Jared, quite a lot in these podcasts. The fact that it's a dependent colony, the fact that it needs the industrial base of the West, the fact that this war through 3 years not only strained America on the level, for instance, of the munitions, or it needed a lot of backing diplomatically, morally. There's a lot of arguments that could be made from the perspective of even those who are concerned about American strategic posture in the world, etc., soft power, all of that. But I think what is significant is that, we are seeing the repercussions of what Israel is committing in the fact that in this kind of radical transformation, for instance, of public opinion in the US, where more now Americans sympathize with Palestinians than with Israelis, where the Democratic Party just recently, with significant numbers, for instance, voted to not actually back, for instance, I think back, of course, the law passed through the Senate because the Republicans and some of the Democrats backed it, but a majority of Democrats rejected the backing of military aid to Israel, even including the Iron Dome, for instance. So even I know, I'm not here saying that policy changes will come radical in the US, but it is straining the relationship. It's making harder for friends of Israel to back it, and also leading slowly but steadily to some policy change, whether on the right or on the left. In Europe, it's the same story as well. People are backing off from Israel, and it's backing in significant way. And we saw that even in the current war, in the sense that when Israel chose to push the US towards this war with Iran, of course, doesn't take away from American agency in this. It did, in many ways, also double down that Israel is not only a moral problem for the US and for the West, it is also now a problem in its excessive use of force, an excessive use of force without really strategic outcomes that you can really attest to, where it was able to recruit American power, which is for Netanyahu's strategic success, but also at the same time exposed American limits, which is a strategic failure, which is now returning back to haunt not only the American president, but also the Israelis. So in this sense, I think that, in the larger moment of this kind of festive celebration of death penalties and destruction of schools and the capacity to commit massacres, it is something that has been heavily costly and it will actually still feed a lot of problems for Israel. And despite the fact that it is trying to channel this, we are going to be super Sparta, independent, autonomous, we'll build our own some sort of economic industrial base and shift our economy towards the production of our own munitions without the need of others, or at least integrate ourselves fundamentally in a necessary way with economic change so nobody can get rid of us easily. Despite that, I mean, Israel is training its relationship with those that actually enable its existence and persistence in our region. So I think that is the problem with Israel's obscene celebration of death, killing, etc. And it's specifically that obscene celebration doesn't come with resolution. It remains in the same impasse. Palestinian resistance remains in Gaza. Lebanese resistance remains resurgent. Iran has new levers in negotiations with the US it didn't have before the current war. So we come to this, new chapter of this ongoing war, Israel finds itself destroying a lot, celebrating the destruction a lot, pulling out champagne bottles in the Knesset to celebrate the death penalty law, losing, the narrative, losing the moral argument, losing its legitimating mechanism, buying TikTok too late because already the damage has been done, and at the same time not being able to really come up with a real strategic, decisive victory as this whole effort was supposed to give it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A few folks asked about the elections that just happened. Any commentary on the local Palestinian elections?
Municipal elections, you mean?
Yeah, I guess Fatah did quite well in them.
I mean, there's a municipal elections that occurred here. They're scheduled every 4 years, so they happen in this context. But of course, the PA really invested a lot of efforts to making them successful. Of course, that is questionable. In the sense, for them, this measure of success was a wide participation of people in the elections. As a way, kind of indirectly saying, through these elections, vis-a-vis, the European diplomats, European countries, we have some form of the Americans, etc. Look, we have some sort of legitimating mechanism here. And by stating, for instance, that Fatah won in municipal elections, that Fatah is popular and has a popular base, etc. So this is one element of why Fatah has invested in this elections. It is the kind of political perception that it actually produces, provisioning with some capital that it can face those that it depends on the level of the structural dependency on aid, diplomatic cover, etc., and positioning itself as a legitimate political actor that has backing from Palestinian society. So in this sense, we have seen in these elections low participation rates. The government speaks about 50%, 52%, but they're relatively low. And at the same time, what actually Fatah and the PA did was force all those who want to participate in the elections to recognize the PLO as the only sole and legitimate body that represents the Palestinians, adding to that also all the agreements that the PLO engaged in, which means that if you want to engage in the elections, you have to basically accept also as a paradigm through which you engage. And that was also a hotly contested political and symbolic concession that a lot of Palestinians in local politics who have some sort of legitimacy in their own local communities did not want to participate in these elections out of this volition. So this is why we saw in a lot of municipalities, in fact, people actually not choosing to go into elections, but agreeing on this kind of unified list where you don't have to engage in any competition, but the town would actually produce its leaders through consensus basis rather than through elections. So that's one way of going out of your way to not actually have a competition and agree on a unified list without the need for elections. But in some places we had competitive elections. Mostly these competitive elections, in local elections, it's family based. There's sometimes issues of clan, but also political parties. But mostly it was kind of Fatah competing with Fatah. Hamas didn't really participate officially in the elections. Islamic Jihad, of course, didn't participate. There was very limited participation even by leftist forces. And even where there was participation by leftist forces, it was kind of tacit, not direct or open. So in many ways, the lists that actually competed in the elections were mostly either independents or people who actually belong to Fatah, either the official Fatah list or people who are rebelling against the official Fatah list but are from Fatah. So it was kind of an intra-Fatah election more than anything else. And of course, we should also mention that the dynamics of who's elected in these kind of local elections are very much also local, in the sense what people see, who can head a municipality, who could benefit, things like sewage, garbage services, rebuilding roads, things along those lines. So the priority for people is not necessarily, grand political questions when it comes to municipalities. Again, municipalities maybe in Palestinian history played a very important role and had that kind of political consequences in the 70s and 80s, when people did tend to look at municipal local elections through the eyes of those who are more nationalist, as a way or as a rejoinder against the military occupation. But in this current moment, people's priorities basically on a municipal level is who is competent enough to lead the institution of the municipality towards better services. So we shouldn't, overread them as politically symbolic in the way at least the PA is trying to represent them. And again, there was no real intra-political competition going on in these elections. And at the same time, again, it had this type of symbolic election concession preceding it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful context for sure. What do I do with my questions? Hang on a second. So let's talk about the piece on the neocons and Trump. And I'm always like, when I saw it, I was like, oh no, is this going to be some kind of factional discussion? And sometimes I get, frustrated with those because it doesn't take into context like the full totality and all of that. But actually, it's a very, very interesting piece, and I encourage people to check it out, because you're kind of tracing something that we've seen with the Trump administration in terms of its kind of rhetoric, moving to a more open embrace of, these violent, talking about crushing civilizations and all of these kind of things, which we've had discussions about on here. But you kind of trace this architecture in recent years, at least, back to this figure of Elliot Cohen, who wrote a piece about air power, or co-authored a piece about air power during the Gulf War, which, for folks who don't know, that's the one under Bush Sr. between 1990 and 91. So talk a little bit about some of the things that Cohen advocated and how you see that in terms of the Trump administration's approach to warfare that kind of fits within those paradigms.
Well, I think to understand this, I think the Gulf War is a very important cornerstone of this idea of having war without casualties, or even war without, battles. The idea of a shock and awe campaign, of using this mix of precision bombs or smart bombs with air campaigns, reducing American military casualties, but even also like reducing casualties on the other side. So it doesn't really create the type of um, opposition that the Vietnam War created because of the high casualty numbers, because of also the high civilian Vietnamese casualties that were actually being killed in mass, because of this kind of fierce battles that were happening. And the Americans came up with this kind of shock and awe, using air power, precision strikes, etc., targeting in a way that would render the enemy so bewildered, so in shock, so in awe that they would lose any sense of ability to actually or capacity to resist American military might. So on this level, the Gulf War is very important, and it continued to be important. But I think what Eliot Cohen already in the 1990s was doing is to remind American strategists of the fact that war is friction, it's brutal, it's hell. And in fact, what interests me and why I brought it up, at least in this specific historic moment, is that for two reasons. First of all, because people like Eliot Cohen, are important in this kind of belt that takes Israeli military ideas and bring them fully into articulation also in the US. This is one element of it. The second element of it is that I think there is something to this kind of permissibility of air power that allows leaders like Trump, who enjoy the idea of a spectacle and who want the spectacle as a form of, kind of an assertion of their narcissistic power and an assertion of their capacity, as we saw with what he did, for instance, with the kidnapping of the president of Venezuela, Maduro, and bringing him into the U.S. in this kind of special operation, this kind of swift, spectacular forms of actions. And I think that's why I wanted to really pull these lines and threads, because as Trump was basically threatening the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Iran, including power plants, distillation plants, and all that and of course the oil infrastructure and the gas infrastructure that is very fundamental and also important for the Iranian economy. That this comes out of this type of permissibility. But also, if we look at what Cohen really argues, he argues for things Israel has been doing and the US has been really doubling down on in the recent conjuncture, because he argues for the importance of decapitation strikes, for instance. And he brings up these type of examples. And we've seen how the Israelis have been operating on these very premises. No? Take out the leadership. That is one element of what should be done in the war. And in fact, Eliot Cohen kind of pushes against the line that Saddam Hussein should have been killed, that one of the early targets should have been the killing of Saddam Hussein, for instance, in the Gulf War. And that was a limitation, or that was a mistake on the part of the American campaign at that particular moment. So this is one element that is there. And this kind of wholesale destruction, that war at the end of the day and air campaigns at the end of the day should destroy civilian infrastructure, military infrastructure, all these different nods that in which society depends in order to pressure a country or society to really surrender. So this is the ideas, and I don't think these are ideas that come from Eliot Cohen specifically. They have been tied to air power more broadly since its first inception. Air power since its early inception in the early 20th century was conceived as a way to really overcome the battlefield, specifically after the trench warfare of the First World War. The idea of targeting enemy societies, targeting the industrial base, and this is what Israel has been systematically really building up to in Iran, because it wants state collapse. And to induce state collapse, you hit the industrial base, the civilian infrastructure, the leadership. You hit all these different nods, hoping in the end that the state is not able really to repair itself in any meaningful way, and that through this kind of retaining the system of sanctions and economic choking in Iran, that protests will come and erupt, and then maybe Iran either breaks down to different states, or is weakened beyond recognition, or is weakened beyond its ability to project power, or it's in eventually in a state of civil conflict between different warring parties based on ethnic or political or ideological divisions that the Iranian society could produce. So in many instances, I think that the ideas there, although they're not new and they crisscross with air power theory more generally, but they are important to understand the extent to which this tool also kind of influenced leaders in their own decision making, and how also, in many ways, ideas around war making that emanate from Israel make it into the strategic military culture in the US as well. And of course, it goes both ways. It's not only in one direction.
Yeah, appreciated. If anybody ever wants to see a kind of wild moment in American cultural history, just Google "victory through air power" and Walt Disney, and it's a it's a cartoon that Walt Disney made in like 1942 to support air power campaigns against the Nazis. But yeah, it's a wild moment. But I appreciate everything that you shared there. And somebody also asked about the coverage. Alexander was asking about the coverage in that era, and it was when you got the kind of 24-hour coverage with the Gulf War. CNN, in particular, really kind of made a name for itself in being 24-hour coverage, because that was a new thing at that time to have 24-hour news coverage. So that's all the questions I had. There's a couple of things from the chat that I wanted to bring up that I thought would be good. Number of people, of course, have questions about what does it mean that the UAE is leaving OPEC. I don't know if you have an analysis of this yet. It just was like reported today, but it's obviously an interesting development, significant development in certain ways.
Well, I mean, I think the UAE has been, first of all, the UAE has been really hit very hard in the current war, more than perhaps any other state, alongside perhaps Kuwait as well. And it's very understandable why. It's because of, first of all, the UAE has been taking this kind of hawkish position, even publicly, vis-a-vis Iran, and pushing for the expansion of the war, not actually containing the war. So the Iranians also, responded in kind in terms of the intensity of the targeting. And the fact that, the UAE strategically has really shifted towards this kind of complete alliance with Israel, binding its fortunes with Israel in a way that no other even Gulf state has really moved towards, and really diverging in its own intra-competition within the Gulf or the GCC with Saudi Arabia. And we've seen they're clashing in Yemen, for instance, but they're also clashing on different files as the UAE attempts to build its own power, back some of its own, or the forces that it backs in Libya or Sudan or Yemen, and as Saudi moves towards a different divergent policy more broadly. And because OPEC is basically a bit of a Saudi-led kind of constellation, that limits also the amount of what a country could sell in terms of what form of supply a country could really place in the market. And because it has been hit economically hard as a result of this war, not only because it cannot really sell the oil and the gas it has at this current moment, but because also the Emirates has built its economic reputation around tourism, around financial flaws, around direct investment coming from abroad to places like Dubai, its real estate, things along these lines. And, suddenly with this war, this image of this peaceful, quiet, beautiful city on the Persian Gulf like Dubai, of course, it's not really beautiful, but, has really, been damaged significantly. So it has lost its reputation and such. And I think that the Emirati leadership is looking for ways to even sell more of its oil, more of its products in a way that is not limited by whatever agenda that in terms of pricing that OPEC as a cartel really agrees on. So it really wants to move independently. This is part of the reason why it's moving in this sense. And they're not happy to constrain themselves in terms of the supply that they want to put in the market. And I think partially is to make up for the cost of the war, partially is because they want to really free themselves from Saudi Arabian influence more broadly.
Okay,
This is a really
thank
fast, I don't know really what's motivating it. I saw the news before I came in, but it's a really fast analysis. I mean, but I think this is part of the trajectory here.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, obviously, there's a lot to kind of digest in terms of what's going on there. But I think obviously it's happening in the context of of the war and of the strain, right, economically and otherwise. Um, so, um, last thing from PJ just asked, more curious to hear more about perspectives in the Zionist settler colony since March, meaning, in the context of this current war, in terms of the impact of the counterattacks from Iran and the overall trajectory of the settler colonial project. And kind of same question for Palestinians. So, and I guess that's another interesting question is like, I saw there was some discussion that there was still like 1% population growth or something like that in Israel over the last year or something like that. But I think there's real questions that people have of like, there's obviously a lot of expansion of settlements and stuff like that in the West Bank and everything. But I think people also question of like, is there a will to continue to move forward in this kind of way? Like, are there more settlers that are being developed to do these things, right? Or is it? I'm just curious how you're kind of reading all those dynamics.
Look, I think we over magnify things like outward immigration, inward immigration. I mean, we're trying to find, if anything, I mean, okay, so let me just treat this question for like more systematically, and then I'll go into the immigration paradigm. So the first thing I think that we should take into account that after October 7th, Israel really moved away from one of its primary strategic doctrines, which David Ben-Gurion, who established, one of the leaders that established the State of Israel and its first prime minister, really plays, which is the idea of early warning, deterrence, and decisive action. These are the three. And the whole doctrine was built on fast wars, usually on the enemy's battlefield space and on the land of the enemy, not within Israel's proper or historic Palestine proper. Because Israel is strategically small, it's a constrained geography. The idea that Israel should engage in really fast-paced wars, decisive actions, and that it should always have the ability of early warning, meaning that it knows the intentions of its enemies and when they will attack. Of course, we already can say that, in Tufan al-Aqsa, early warning didn't work, and decisive action came very late, and that Israel moved through this kind of shattering experience that we spoke about towards this kind of post-traumatic war doctrine of perpetual war that is fused with messianic beliefs of decisive and total victory, and that is also puts its entire hedge and wager on force, and if force doesn't solve a problem, then use more force. And I think that in many ways, the reading, again, even coming out of Israel currently, is that there is this kind of sobering up happening in Israel, just generally. That this doctrine perhaps has reached its limits. That this shift towards what they call, for instance, preemptive action, that because we failed in early warning with Hamas and Palestinian resistance on October 7th, that we should just deny all our enemies our capability. We shouldn't agree towards any form of deterrence equation between us and any of the resistant forces. This kind of change of the equation where they're pushing towards, Hezbollah should hand its weapons, Hamas should hand in its weapons, Iran should basically collapse or change completely the direction, stop supporting all of the resistance networks in the region, and going for that kind of total defeat. That doctrine now is under duress. I wouldn't say that it's completely out of the view, because it's still the leaders that are currently in Israel, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, the entire, are still very much committed to it. But I think that the Israeli society, Israeli strategic think tanks, Israeli military personnel are thinking through, or military leaders as well, are thinking that this perpetual conflict, perpetual war paradigm has reached its limits, and that we're exposing our weaknesses now in many ways. Weaknesses vis-a-vis our relationship to the US and our dependency on it, weaknesses in terms that, perpetual war has not really solved any of the problems that we claim to have set out to solve. Again, as I said earlier, Palestinian resistance remains in place. Hamas is still the power that controls the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah is resurgent. Iran has more levers than before. So in this sense, I think the Israelis are in this shaky ground. And that shaky ground is increasing with the pull that the Lebanese front is having on discussions within Israeli society more broadly, and Israeli also military leaders and political class more broadly, as Israel is becoming more constrained, etc. So it's, Lebanon is exposing this even more and more slowly but steadily, as these FPV drones hit Israeli military personnel, injuring a lot of of their soldiers, and rendering them, seriously injured, returning to Israel. That kind of discussion will continue. So this is one element of it, is that we are seeing now at least a crack in the way this doctrine has been applied, and the way Israel for some time felt a sense of exhilaration around some of the successes that it really garnered. Not only its capacity of destruction, not only in this wholesale destruction of the Gaza, but specifically in its war with Hezbollah, assassination of its leaders, kind of like the killing and the martyrdom of Nasrallah as some sort of redemption for what happened in October 7th. The fall of the Syrian regime, the sense that they claimed also the Syrian regime dynamic of collapse was tied to Israeli military action. It was indirectly, but not necessarily directly. The fact that they've taken control over large swaths of Gaza, 50% of the Gaza Strip, the Lebanese southern areas within the south of Lebanon, or the Lebanese southern belt, but also within Syria, attacking Iran for the first time in the 12-day war, recruiting American power to attack Iran again in this kind of mutual joint attack that the Americans and the Israelis engaged. And Israel was on a high, but now I think, it's feeling a bit different in Israel, that, they've hit a wall, they've hit a limit. Of course, they're hedging or wagering that the war will renew itself. And in that Netanyahu is able to really push the ball or the can down the road. But, even if the war renews itself and we have another war effort campaign, as I was saying, Iran was capable, without even the Strait of Hormuz, of, again, inflicting a lot of damage on both the Gulf allies, American military bases, American military infrastructure, and at the same time on Israel itself. And of course, that that will mean the intensification of the war in Lebanon again, which means also that Hezbollah will engage more militarily heavily in any war. So there's no certainty around what another round will actually bring out. It could actually bring out even further, if you want, sobering up on the part of the Israelis and the limitations of this kind of doctrine that they have, fusing messianic beliefs with this post-trauma of what the Palestinian resistance was capable of actually doing on October 7th, and at the same time, believing that only through military pressure and force over the long term that they can get any form of real radical outcome. And as Netanyahu claims with his grandiose sense of self, that he will change the face of the Middle East. So this is part of the reckoning. And as they were doing that, as I was already outlining earlier, they lost a lot of their credibility. They lost public opinions. they're straining their relationships all over the place. So this is one element of it. The second element is a much more, if we want to look at social dynamics more broadly. Yes, I mean, we talked about this kind of social dynamics of, dozens of cases of Israelis, for instance, being recruited as spies, regular people, taking small amounts of payments, $2,000, $1,000, and, selling intelligence to Iranian intelligence operatives. But I think on the level of this dynamic of who goes out of Israel, most of the Israelis that leave come from this kind of upper middle Ashkenazi, European Jewish, mostly. I mean, not all, but most. And what it means is actually a doubling down on the doctrine that we've already kind of outlined. Because the social base on which Israel relies on perpetual force, on this messianic, are either from this kind of ideological messianic right-wing forces, which are the spearhead of the Israeli Zionist or the settler colonial movement right now, or from the social classes, middle classes, lower classes, working classes within Israel that are usually marginalized, live in marginalized community, and who believe in this kind of populist rhetoric around the mix of religion, technology, and force, and its ability to really create this moment or this array of Israeli omnipotent power across the region through brutality of its force. So, in fact, this is the paradox of this dynamic. That yes, there is an outward movement outside of Israel, and it is coming from, the cultural elites, the upper middle classes, critical Israeli scholars, people who are just generally fed up with living in Israeli society and want to go to other countries and expand their horizons and move to London or Berlin or the US, and they're not necessarily people who have renounced Israel in any significant way, but either we're working for economic opportunity or going for jobs, or just wanting to experience something different than the small claustrophobic place in which they live, or running away from military service, and whatever their reasons might be. There is that outward movement, but it does come from that social base that usually used to put a stopgap and used to be the more pragmatic part of the settler colonial structure, who wanted, for instance, to move towards normalization or peace agreements, or was willing to give land for peace type of formula. So it is in a paradox. The paradox here is that the more we see movement outside, is the more that actually the paradigm in which we exist continues to persist as the one that Israel adopts in full force, brute force, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. That's really it as far as what I had for questions. Is there anything that you wanted to kind of say in closing?
No, I mean, I think we covered all the bases that I also wanted to cover. Yeah. So from my side.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Always, these are wonderful conversations. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all your analysis and your time. Folks, make sure to check out the articles in the show description. And I'm sure that we will have Abdaljawad back on next month or something like that, somewhere soon down the line, so that we can revisit and update some of these things. But and check out the latest work that you're doing. All right. So appreciate it again. Thank you, man.
Thank you, Jared.